Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show. Imagine that you had a girlfriend, and all she ever talked about was herself. All she was ever interested was herself and the myriad permutations of her consciousness, that she dragged herself into every story. Everything came back to her pain and suffering, and how the whole point, the sole point of the universe was to frustrate her every desire. Well, change girlfriend into Black Lives Matter, and now you understand Black Lives Matter. Now you understand the Black Intifada, Black fragility. That is one of the most important manifestations of the collapse of civilization that we're seeing across America today. And here's one of the latest examples. This is from Mark Dice. Bubba Wallace's father wants to ban all garage door pull handles now because the looped knots are a racist symbol of death. That's right. We can't have nice things anymore. We can't even have looped knots, because apparently they terrify Black people. Now, it's tempting to say that, no, this couldn't possibly be true. This is idiotic. But the fact is that this sort of idiocy becomes internalized in the same way that the notorious N-word is something that cannot be said by white people. You can't even quote some bad person saying it in the past to make a point, because the N-word has two consequences. It either reduces Black people to hysterics, to uncontrollable tears and hysteria, or alternately, it induces a murderous rage, which is, of course, righteous, because the N-word is the worst word in the history of the world. It is a taboo word, like the word, like the tetragrammaton. It must not be uttered, or else God or the gods will be offended. Now, never mind, as I've mentioned many times before, that most Black people hear this word uttered by their own people dozens or hundreds of times a day, and they are wont to use this word often at the end of every sentence, dozens or hundreds of times a day. No, if we say it, it's intolerable. If they say it, it's just everyday parlance. This is another example of Black fragility. And I suppose the problem is that we have tolerated this. We have even encouraged it. From roughly the 1960s onwards, an elite consensus was formed that Black people have no moral agency. They are a prisoner of their history. They are a prisoner of their desires. They're a prisoner of their instincts. And so we see half a century and more of making endless excuses for Black people. And to the point now where it's considered bad form or worse to mention things like illegitimacy rates, or to mention crime rates. Let's see, Black Lives Matter. But again, it's considered very bad form to ask the question, well, if Black Lives Matter, why do we have this shooting gallery in Black-dominated neighborhoods every weekend, especially every week, especially every weekend? Isn't there an enormous contradiction there? Why is it simply a commonplace for Black people to shoot and kill each other over trifles, such as someone wearing the wrong colored shirt, say? There are regular rallies in Black communities against violence, as if violence is something that, I don't know, falls from the sky. It's a virus that infects people. It's not Black people hurting, killing each other. No, it's something separate from that, because, again, Black people have no moral agency. Now, a couple of decades ago, a great many people were alarmed and even outraged by what had happened with hip hop music, that it became essentially a celebration of criminality, of monstrous male behavior, both in terms of sexual expression and violence, a mindless celebration of the possession of consumer goods. But then the elite decided that this was a genuine expression of Black passion, that all this talk about I had that hoe before you had that hoe, and I have a Maybach and you don't. Well, this was noble somehow, and it must be celebrated. Now, I think that we can see the results before us today. The strange thing is, which is little remarked upon, was that the civil rights movement, it didn't really have all that much of a struggle. I mean, if you look at, let's say, from Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 to the passing of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, that's a 14-year period in which the position of Black people in the United States was transformed, utterly transformed. So one would have thought at that point, the Civil Rights Revolution, well, it's a victory. So we're going to move on. We're going to look at the problems of Black people in America and attempt to ameliorate them. But no, that's not what happened. Kipling famously wrote, if you keep on paying the Dane Geld, you'll never get rid of the Dane. But this is different than that, in that the more that has been given to Black people in America, in terms of money, in terms of programs, in terms of perks and privileges, perquisites, and in terms of white kowtowing, the angrier Black people became. And there is no end to this. Now, I don't know, sensible leaders might have said that it's probably not a good idea to resist police arrest. You know, it's probably not a good idea committing crimes, no matter how petty, if one wants to stay out of difficulties with the police. Now, I'll have to admit that a lot of the crimes that Black people find themselves in serious trouble for, often deadly trouble for, are trivial and perhaps probably would have been best treated by the police in a different manner. But you see grievances that are created that don't exist. For instance, the supposed crime of driving while Black. And of course, this is based on the notion that apparently cops have some superhuman visual powers, that they can note the race of someone in a car, I don't know, hundreds of feet or hundreds of yards away. And even in cases where body cams or dash cams prove that there was no cause for complaint, as in the case of Marcy Yen, who is a Canadian media meat puppet, apparently we were wrong again, because the fact that she had broken the law, she'd run a stop sign. It doesn't matter, actually, because the very presence of a police officer is a gross offense to Black people, and it really can't be tolerated, because apparently when in the presence of police officers, Black people cannot contain themselves. We've heard a great deal of talk about white fragility in recent years, but white people have proved themselves to be quite resilient in the face of a ferocious onslaught of mockery, disdain, and even hatred against them, or even the idea of white people. It is Black people who demonstrate fragility. Let's see, this is from Reuters. Calls for reparations gain steam as U.S. reckons with racial injustice. Now, keep in mind that this racial injustice only works in one direction. President Trump was called out by some leading conservative for retweeting two videos from Matt Walsh showing or just demonstrating the quotidian, the everyday violence that white people suffer from Black people. But this was thought to be outrageous because apparently the suffering or even the killing of white people is not all that significant. It's trivial. It doesn't matter because Black lives matter. Now, when the very phrase all lives matter, or the phrase it's okay to be white, become examples of hate speech, this is another tremendous example of Black fragility. Black lives matter. Well, of course they matter. No one is disputing that. Now, the catchphrase, the meme, Black Lives Matter, it suggests that society has been run as if they don't matter. Now, that's clearly not true. It's not true in America. It's not true in Canada. It's not true in Britain. It's not true in France. It's not true in Germany, because for decades, the leadership of these countries has gone to Black people and said, what do you want? How can we make your lives better? But it's never enough. Now, Black Lives Matter has taken on a darker meaning. Essentially, these are our countries now. Get out of the way and take what is coming to you, white people. This reckoning, I guess one of these memos in journalism went out in the last week. You might have noticed this word reckoning is appearing regularly in all of these stories about Black anger. Now, a reckoning is a terrible thing. But no, apparently this is the way that it's going to be. Let's see, when California State Assemblywoman Shirley Weber introduced a bill last year to study reparations for African Americans, she was worried people wouldn't accept that racial inequality and injustice were still alive and well. This is an example of categorical confusion. One can accept that racial inequality and injustice are still alive and well without calling for reparations for African Americans. Reparations for what exactly? For slavery, which ended in 1865, for Jim Crow, which of course did not, it was only in the South where Jim Crow obtained, but Jim Crow was finished by the 1960s for what? Redlining from the 1930s? Let's see. Instead, the bill came up for a vote 2 weeks later after the death of an unarmed Black man, George Floyd, at the hands of a white police officer. Well, actually, at the hands of 4 police officers, one of whom was white, which spurred a nationwide reckoning on that. There's the word reckoning again. Things are getting very explicit and very ugly. It passed the Assembly on June 11th with a 56-5 vote. Maybe we'll be a model for what can happen at the federal level, Weber told Thomson Reuters. The bill goes next to the California State Senate, where she expects it to pass and then be signed into law by the governor. So the state of California going to pay these reparations to what? To Black people who are not even in California during the times of slavery? I mean, how many black people would have been in California in the slavery days? A few hundred? Now, obviously, there weren't all that very many slaveholders, and they were overwhelmingly in the South. Who gets this reparations money? Are we going to have to come up with Nuremberg laws? Because for several generations now, a significant number of black people in America are not descendants of slaves, certainly not descendants of American slaves. They have come from the Caribbean or from South America, and now increasingly from Africa. Do they get those reparations too? Are black people going to have to prove that they are indeed the descendants of American slaves? Because I mentioned the Hitler's Nuremberg laws, but if some element of proof is going to be required, then you're going to have people screaming about Hitler and the Nazis. So I'm just assuming that every black person in the United States gets it, regardless of whether he showed up from Somalia or the Congo the day after yesterday. And the question of why should all white people be responsible for this, especially because the great number of Americans who came to, white people who came to America after 1865, or the fact which I mentioned earlier, that there were few Americans, white Americans, who actually owned slaves, that slavery throughout history has been a process whereby the elite uses foreigners to avoid paying their own people decent wages. White people as a whole in the South did not benefit by slavery, quite the contrary. But no, reparations are on the table. Now, one has heard of reparations for decades, but it was considered to be a rather crazy idea. Let's see. In response to protests over racial inequality, the top United Nations official for human rights, yes, the United Nations, speaking about human rights, that's pretty amusing, called on countries to make amends for racist violence through reparations. I'm just wondering whether the countries of West Africa, are they not going to pay any money here? Because it's not as if white people went into the jungles of Africa and hunted down black people. No. The slaves which came to America were hunted down by their own people and sold for profit to Europeans. Ghana, the countries in those areas, shouldn't they pony up as well? Shouldn't they admit their guilt? It's very curious to me to see members of the Black Congressional Caucus wearing kente cloth outfits when they are honoring the people who took captive blacks and sold them into bondage across the Atlantic. In any event, Arif Ali, doesn't sound like an American name, actually, and it doesn't sound like a descendant of slaves, but never mind. He was a lawyer who was part of a UN team on compensation for victims of Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait. He says there's no amount of money that can be paid really to fully repair. No amount of money that can be paid really to fully repair. So we're given a hint here, which is that, let's say, in a moment of madness, the Congress of the United States decided to apportion, I don't know, $5 trillion for reparations to American blacks. Do you think that's going to be the final payment? I don't think so, because again, there's no amount of money that can be paid really to fully repair. Now, this really gets to the heart of it, because money is useful. Everyone needs money. Well, that's why they call it money, as David Mamet wrote. But there are wounds that cannot be healed with money. Of course, that doesn't stop courts from granting huge amounts of payments. Oh, I don't know, to parents, dead children, and the like. It's a disgusting business, but it's fully part of our culture now. But make no mistake, one gigantic reparations payout is not going to heal Black fragility. Concurrent with Black fragility, we have seen groveling from white people. And the angrier the Black people get, the more white people grovel. There's a remarkable story in the New York Times, which is now all Black all the time, yesterday from Caitlin Dickerson, a young Black woman. And it takes place in Minnesota, which is the Scandinavian American homeland. At state-lined Minneapolis, when Sherry Albers moved 3 decades ago into Powderhorn Park, a tree-lined Minneapolis neighborhood known as a haven to leftist activists and bohemian artists like herself, she went to work sprucing it up. Yes, I haven't looked up Sherry Albers, but I see that she moved 3 decades ago to Powderhorn Park. Is she a native Minnesotan? I rather doubt it. And I like to mock Midwestern Scandinavians, but to a certain extent, they can be absolved because many people who lived in places in the United States which were, well, objectively bad for many reasons, decided to move to places which were objectively good. But they brought their politics with them. The very same ideas that wrecked the places they came from were going to be translated to the paradises, the white-topias to which they had moved. Albers became a block club leader, organizing her mostly white neighbors, boo, to bring in playgrounds and help tackle long-standing issues with crime. On many nights, she banged on the car windows of men who had come to solicit prostitutes outside her door. She said she kept meticulous notes when dozens of men would gather in a circle for gang meetings in the park across the street. But times have changed. After the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police, Ms. Albers, who is white, and many of her progressive neighbors have vowed to avoid calling law enforcement into their community. Doing so, they believed, would add to the pain that Black residents of Minneapolis were feeling and could put them in danger. Now, you may have thought that I was exaggerating. Where it is now a widespread belief, that the very sight of police induces a kind of mental collapse among Black people. But no, it's true. Already, that commitment is being challenged. 2 weeks ago, dozens of multicolored tents appeared in the neighborhood park. That's not a good sign. They were brought by homeless people who were displaced during the unrest. Oh, the unrest that gripped the city, not riots. It was unrest. The multiracial group of roughly 300 new residents seems to grow larger and more entrenched every day. They do laundry, listen to music, and strategize about how to find permanent housing. It would appear that many of them have already found permanent housing. Some are hampered by mental illness, addiction, or both. Their presence has drawn heavy car traffic into the neighborhood, some from drug dealers. At least 2 residents have overdosed in the encampment and had to be taken away in ambulances. The influx of outsiders has kept Miss Albers awake at night. Though it is unlikely to happen, she has had visions of people from the tent camp forcing their way into her home. She imagines using a baseball bat to defend herself. Not being able to call the police, as she has done for decades, has shaken her. I am afraid, she says. I know my neighbors are around, but I'm not feeling grounded in my city at all. Anything could happen. Is it really your city, Ms. Albers? Let's see. The scores of police killings that they have seen in the news in recent years were not one-off incidents, but part of a systemic problem of the dehumanization of Black people by the police. Actually, the bigger problem is the systematic dehumanization of people, full stop, by the police. the new centurion's attitude, the militarization of the police, the tendency of police to regard everyone they see as a potential malefactor. They are no longer peacekeepers. And there are a great many white people, far more, even proportionally, that have suffered the price than black people. But remember, Black lives matter, and only Black lives matter. In the city where the movement began, residents are not surprised that it's being taken especially seriously in Powderhorn Park, just blocks from Floyd's deadly encounter with the police. For decades, the community has been a refuge for scrappy working-class activists with far-left politics. The biggest day of the year, locals often boast, is the May Day Parade, celebrating laborers. May Day is, of course, a communist holiday. There's a Labor Day in September is the holiday for non-commies. Although it is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Minneapolis, with Black residents making up about 17% of the population, white people, boo, make up the largest group. About a third of the population is Latino. Since the camp appeared, the community has organized shifts for delivering warm meals, medical care, and counseling to people living in the park. They persuaded officials to back off an eviction notice served shortly after the campers arrived. If you go downtown and you see people feeding pigeons, you will notice that there is pigeon excrement everywhere. And we have a similar situation in my city of Victoria. That Victoria has decided to make it itself the most welcoming city in Canada to homeless people. And so people travel the length and breadth of Canada to come to Victoria for that reason. But many in the neighborhood who are already beleaguered from the financial stresses of the coronavirus now say they are eager for the campers to move on to the stable housing away from the park. I'm not being judgmental, said Carrie Nightshade, 44, who explained that she no longer felt comfortable letting her children, 12 and 9, play in the park by themselves. It's not personal. It's just not safe. No, obviously it isn't. Angelina Roslick burst into tears, explaining that she had spent the past 4 years fleeing unstable housing conditions and was struggling more than she cared to admit with the chaos the camp had brought in the neighborhood. Linnea Borden said she had stopped walking her dog through the park because she was tired of being catcalled. Catcalled? My emotions change every 30 seconds, said Tria Hauser, who is part Native American. It's an intersectionality festival. The women agreed to let any property damage, including to their own homes, go ignored and to request a block party permit from the city to limit car traffic. Rather than turn to law enforcement if they saw anyone in physical danger, they resolved to call the American Indian Movement, a national organization created in 1968 to address Native American grievances such as police brutality, which had been policing its own community locally for years. The H.G. Wells, I believe it's the time machine, with the Eloy and the Morlocks? Yes. And this neighborhood in Minneapolis has decided that, yes, let's invite the Morlocks into our neighborhood. What is the worst thing that can happen? And let's see. The impulse many white Powderhorn Park residents have to seek help from community groups rather than from the police is being felt in neighborhoods across the country. But some are finding the commitment hard to stand by when faced with the complex realities of life. Yes, indeed. But the groveling comes first. It must come first. And I will end with a particular story here. Mitchell Erickson's fingers began dialing 911 last week before he had a chance to even consider alternatives when 2 black teenagers, who looked to be 15 at most, cornered him outside his home a block away from the park. One of the boys pointed a gun at Erickson's chest, demanding his car keys. Flustered, Erickson handed over a set, but it turned out to be house keys. The teenagers got frustrated and ran off, then stole a different car down the street. Erickson said later that he would not cooperate with prosecutors in a case against the boys. After the altercation, he realized that if there was anything he wanted, it was to offer them help. But he still felt it had been right to call the authorities because there was a gun involved. 2 days after an initial conversation, his position had evolved. Been thinking more about it, he wrote in a text message. I regret calling the police. It was my instinct, but I wish it hadn't been. I put those boys in danger of death by calling the cops. Actually committing crimes, particularly those involving firearms, put those boys in danger of death. What about the fact that the boys had put his life in danger? Yeah, I know, and yeah, it was scary, but the cops didn't really have much to add after I called them. I haven't been forced to think like this before, so I would have lost my car. So what? At least no one would have been killed. Really? How do you know that, Mitchell Erickson? It is a commonplace for people to hand over their wallets, hand over their keys, their ATM card, their watch, or whatever, and get knifed or shot to death anyway. This is a society, a local community, Powderhorn Park, which is determined, which has evolved an official policy of suicide. It's not going to last for very much longer. There's going to be nothing there. The white people are going to be chased out, or they're going to be killed, or they're going to be turned into, I don't know, zombie servants or something like that. And the New York Times is clearly suggesting that this should be the model for America. And it brings me to a question I've been asking lately. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of irresponsible talk on the right for, I don't know, a couple of decades about upcoming race war and how people are looking forward. These people were looking forward to a race war. Well, what if they gave a race war and only one side came? Because that's what we're looking at in America today. But again, as I say, these things don't happen overnight. If one goes back, say, to the 1960s, and the belief that Black people have no moral agency becomes an acceptable belief, then all manner of consequences ensue, and they are not pleasant consequences. Let's look at the chat here. Okay, BLM may fight slavery in Africa, says Lecomte de Boreas. Dan Allison's poignant stories of inner city life told by sensitive poets. Okay. KMG killing it since Intifada ESP last night show. Why, thank you. Dan Allison, everyone has been stopped by the cops for no reason. That's not racism, it's life. Well, no, that is increasingly true. And I've noticed for quite some time now that when I see a cop car, I don't think this is going to be good. I don't like policemen looking at me because I think that, I don't know, maybe I've done some trivial thing that I'm not supposed to do. Jonathan Pohl says, KMG and I don't drive, so we can't be arrested for driving while white. That is quite true. Brandon Smith says, the warrior part of SJW captures their penchant for turning to violence first perfectly. Let's see, Brandon Smith again. China colonized Africa last decade. Maybe they'll go back for the tasty buffet food. Well, yes, the Chinese are going to be, they're not very sentimental people. Okay, who else do we have in the chat? Danny Rose, anyone who didn't roll their eyes the first time they heard Black Lives Matter should leave America. Jonathan Pohl, California was never a slave state. That is true, but again, this is going to have to be universal because, the states that were slave states, I suppose the rest of the country is going to complain about being dragged into it, but it will be argued, and I'm not making this up. Well, why didn't the North declare war on the slave states? I don't know, going back before 1789. Why was slavery allowed to exist in America? William Hicks says reparations, how would that work? Slavery was legal prior to 1863 or so arguments for damages would be rooted in post-Civil War. Segregation, very messy, it won't work. Just because it won't work doesn't mean that it won't be tried. Walrus Libertarian says people who never owned slaves are kneeling to people who never were slaves. Again, Professor Paul Obama and Kamala Harris are the descendants of slave holders. Yes, that is very amusing. Tweety Bird says, I want more reparations for the depredations endured by me Irish forebears. Yes, there were the indentured servants sent to the Caribbean, many of whom died. No, I discourage all such talk of equating Irish suffering with the suffering of other groups, because, the Irish in Canada and in America, it's a success story. So stop whining about, they looked askance at us when we came in the 1840s and 1850s. Just, I'm of Irish descent myself, and this sort of Me Tooism sickens me. Super Predator says the 1950s were a lot closer to the time of slavery, yet racial disparities have worsened substantially since then. Yes, indeed, they have. Walrus Libertarian says the owner of BET said $11 trillion. Chogokin666 says the demand for all rights and no concept of responsibility is libertinism and leads to the descent into barbarism. Well, Thomas Aquinas had something interesting to say to this, that on the question of animal rights, Aquinas concluded that we may do anything to animals that we wish, so long as we do not delight in their suffering. And why was this? Because animals can have no rights because they have no responsibilities. And one can see today the folly of according rights to people who truly have no responsibility. Dan Ellison says the Southern Baptist Convention has issued a formal apology for slavery about every 15 years since the 1960s. Yeah, I mentioned the other day, Sam Francis took issue with the Southern Baptists on this, given that slavery is not denounced in either the Old or New Testaments. And for his pains, Dinesh D'Souza organized a gang to cancel him, and it wrecked his journalistic career. Yeah. Let's see. Do we have anyone new in the chat? Brandon Smith, average pleb is like, let them have their movement with few realizing how much it could cost them. Well, no, because the costs are supposedly borne by someone else. There's no longer any sense of community that exists. And in any event, the federal money printer just goes, brrr. That's how it works. Jonathan Pohl says, I did some calculation. BLM might accept. Okay, I'm not going to finish that. Tricky Woo says, Karen is an anti-white trope. Well, I was discussing that in some detail the other day because there seems to be a tremendous disagreement about what Karen is, whether Karen is a meddling left-wing lady or whether Karen is some right-wing lady who cannot stand the sight of minorities. Super Predator says, believing that all your life outcomes are entirely out of your own hands must do wonders for your psyche. Yes. Jim Smith, Linda Chavez assistant John Miller, not of National Review, was a part of the Get Francis gang. Yes, it is good to be reminded of this, that these conservative ink types are despicable. Absolutely despicable. Okay, so let's talk about groveling. Disney changing Splash Mountain ride tied to Jim Crow film. Oh dear. Amid calls to change the Splash Mountain theme park ride because of its ties with Song in the South, the 1946 movie many view as racist. This is a delightful film, by the way. Disney officials said Thursday it was recasting the ride to make it based on The Princess and the Frog, the 2009 Disney film with an African-American female lead. Yes, everything at Disneyland and Disney World should be black. Hollywood should be entirely black. It should all be black. These are reparations I can get behind. The Fortune 500 companies should have exclusively black executives and members of the board. Again, reparations, I think we can all get behind. The new concept is inclusive, one that all of our guests can connect with and be inspired by, and it speaks to the diversity of the millions of people who visit our parks each year, the Disney Post said. With racist stereotypes and Old South tropes. Ooh, tropes. Song of the South is a mix of live-action cartoons and music featuring an old black plantation laborer named Uncle Remus. Oh, Disney made up Uncle Remus, did it? Who enchants a white city boy with fables of talking animals. As I say, it is a delightful film. Oh, the Dixie Chicks have changed their name to the Chicks. Okay. Did they check to see whether this was registered? Because Lady Antebellum changed their name to Lady A without checking to see whether there was some other musician called Lady A. So I guess they're going to have to make a big payout. Because I guess Dixie is now a forbidden word. I suggested that changing their name to the Biddies would have been more appropriate. I mean, Biddy, it's chicken derivated. What does someone say? The Clucks might be a better name. I'm looking at their singer Natalie here. She's got this sort of punk thing going on with her hair. It's not really working for her. What is she, like 46 years old? Okay. Oh, Civil War documentary filmmaker Ken Burns calls for Confederate statues to be removed. Maybe he should call for his documentaries to be removed and for the masters to be destroyed. Because if Ken Burns felt that much, that so hostily to the South, well then, that's not in his documentaries. I think they're going to have to be re-edited. No, I think it would be better to have them destroyed. During discussion with CNN's Chris Cuomo, yeah, real Algonquin roundtable they got there at CNN. The director of numerous historical documentaries, including the seminal 9-part movie Civil War, came out strongly in favor of sweeping prestigious symbols of the Confederacy from the public landscape. I think we're in the middle of an enormous reckoning right now. You see what I mean about the memo? In which the anxieties and the pains and the torments of injustice are bubbling up to the surface. It's very important for people like me, of my complexion. He's not white. He's just have a light complexion. To be as quiet as possible and to listen. No, to retire. What you must do is retire and hand over your company, your production company, to black people. Okay, you've had your time. You've had your innings. What I know from my reading of history is that the Confederate monuments have to go. It's curious that he didn't say this at the time, that his 9-part documentary was so acclaimed. The monuments are an attempt to rewrite history and to essentially celebrate a false narrative about what happened during the Civil War and to send the wink winks, the dog whistles, as we're fond of saying today, across the generations of what the Civil War was about. No, that's not what the statues are about. The statues are about men who fought for the Confederacy. Brave men, many of whom died, fighting for their people. That's what the statues are about. When Cuomo asked if some of the protesters are going too far by attacking statues of former presidents Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Ulysses Grant, Burns acknowledged that, but pleaded for patience. Of course, there's a danger in going too far. It's the passions of the moment, and let's think about it. Let's hold off and reserve judgment for 1 second and consider that more than a quarter of the presidents of the United States of America founded on the idea that all men are created equal. No, it was not founded on that idea. The guy who wrote that, Jefferson, owned 300 human beings in his lifetime, by the way. Yes. When the founders were talking about men being created equal, they were not referring to black people And obviously they didn't mean it literally, because if they meant it literally and universally, there would have been no slavery allowed in the United States of America. Tina Fey. Oh dear, Tina Fey. I mentioned the other day that I quite like Tina Fey. It is rare for a comedic actress to be physically attractive, and she is. It is even more rare for a comedic actress, a great comedic actress, to be physically attractive and also an outstanding writer. So she hits the trifecta there. And I mentioned that she was in her disavowal of the blackface episodes of 30 Rock. She was being disingenuous because these episodes had a specific point. And they were really questioning black fragility, because she kept hammering on about the position of women in television. So she was given, someone found this video. They were bound to find some such video. She was awarded the Mark Twain Prize at the Kennedy Center, and she said that she hoped that 100 years from now, like Mark Twain, people would find her work racist. Big mistake there, Tina. Should never have apologized in the first place, because I think you're done now. Native Americans protesting Trump trip to Mount Rushmore. As if the American elite cares anything about Native Indians. This is just outrageous. This is from AP. Trump's plans to kick off Independence Day with a showy display at Mount Rushmore have angered Native Americans who view the monument as a desecration of land violently stolen from them and used to pay homage to leaders hostile to indigenous people. Several groups led by Native American activists are planning protests for Trump's July 3rd visit, part of Trump's, quote, comeback campaign for a nation reeling from sickness, unemployment, and recently social unrest. Okay. Oh, and the sickness, the unemployment, social unrest, all Trump's fault? No. This is solely an attempt to embarrass Donald Trump. They don't care about the Indians. They never have. Jenny Slate and Kristen Bell will no longer voice biracial characters in the animated shows Big Mouth and Central Park, respectively. In a statement posted to Instagram Wednesday, Slate explained that she had stepped down from the role of Missy because her original reasoning for signing on to voice the character was flawed, an example of white privilege. At the start of the show, I reasoned with myself that it was permissible to play Missy because her mom is Jewish and white, as am I, Slate wrote. But Missy is also black, and black characters on an animated show should be played by black people. She apologized for, quote, engaging in an act of erasure of black people, unquote. Oh, boo, groan, hiss. Slate has Cuban ancestry as well. And I guess AOC says the Puerto Ricans or the Hispanics are black. So doesn't that count, being Cuban? Now, my own position is this. Okay, fine. Let's just have all black characters played by black people. I don't want any more black people voicing white characters. And when it comes to historical reenactments, I don't want a black actress playing, Margaret of Anjou. I do not want to see black people singing white opera roles. I don't want to see black Carmens. I do not want to see black people in Mozart operas, because it should be one way or the other. If it's only black people can play or voice black people, well, let's just make this strict all the way down the line. Of course, it be a very serious problem for, say, a lot of minorities. I don't know how much work there would be for Jewish actors and actresses if they could only play Jewish roles. But no, let's go with this. Let's go with the complete segregation of show business. Oh, yes, and what is happening on the ground during this epidemic of black fragility? This is from Channel 4 in Minneapolis, I guess. Incessant fireworks keeping Minneapolis residents on edge amid gun violence boom. No, this isn't a story about, well, yeah, okay, I suppose. During a time when gun violence, again, yeah, gun violence, the passive language. Those guns are out of control. Is becoming more common across Minneapolis. The consistent sound of fireworks is increasing fear and anxiety. It's not just the frequency or time that is a concern for some neighborhoods. It's trying to determine if it's actually fireworks they're hearing. That's partially true, but it's also partially not true. Most people are averse to explosions. And the fact that, they tell me it's fireworks. These loud, overwhelming noises, they induce fear and often terror in people. But let's not talk about who's responsible for this in Minneapolis or in New York City, say. Again, let's just keep using this passive language. So, we're hearing about a reckoning. We're talking about liberation. And this is from NBC Channel 4 in New York. New York City criminal justice system imploding. NYPD boss says as homicides hit 5-year high. A perfect storm of COVID-19 shutdowns within the judicial system, which have shunted indictments against the most dangerous illegal gun criminals. A breakdown in the city's social safety nets, which has prisoners being released from jail straight into homelessness. Oh, you see, it's not the releasing violent people from jail. It's the homelessness aspect of it. And bail reform laws and case deferments. Oh, reform laws. Okay. And case deferments have all hindered the NYPD's efforts to staunch the bleeding. NYP Commissioner Dermot Shea says, you cannot keep people safe without keeping bad, dangerous people off the streets. That is racist. That is just pure racism. You have a criminal justice system that's imploding. That's the kindest way to put it. Well, you say you want a revolution, and they're getting one. Community, immigration, they don't mix. They don't mix. It's not possible to have stable communities when the makeup of the people in a country is constantly changing, when there's just this endless churn. But the left wants the churn because these people overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party. And the right, I don't mean the right, actually I mean the Chamber of Commerce types conservatism, Inc. They want it because it means that white Americans won't be able to find jobs, and it means that Americans per se will have to work for less, and they should be grateful for whatever pittance they are paid. After all, if they don't earn a living wage, Uncle Sucker can make up the difference. From AP, for the generation of Americans not yet old enough to drive, the democratic future has arrived. For the first time, non-whites and Hispanics were a majority of people under age 16 in 2019, an expected demographic shift that will grow over the coming decades, according to figures released by the U.S. Census Bureau on Thursday. We are browning from the bottom up in our age structure, said William Frey, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. This is going to be a diversified century for the United States, and it's beginning with this youngest generation. And how is that working out for you? How is that working out for you? Obviously, America had racial problems before Hart-Celler in 1965, but the racial problems have gotten much, much worse. And in fact, it's difficult to speak of America existing as anything other than a legal entity. My country in the 1965 had no racial problems to speak of because it was very much a homogenous country. But the elite of my country decided that Canada was boring. It was a stale, pale, and male. So Canada had to be opened up in the world. And now we have our racial problems, very, very serious racial problems, which are only going to get worse because the Liberal government has decided that even after the COVID-19 panic disaster, it's going to increase immigration. And even more so than the United States, Canada is strictly only a legal entity. It stands for nothing now. And as I've been predicting for roughly 25 years, given the ridicule of patriotism that has been common in the United States, but more so in my country, if ever a government has to ask for sacrifices from its people, it is not going to get them. Sacrifice for what exactly? I see that Carly Fiorina is in the news. She ran for president in 2016. Remember that? Well, that was a pretty exciting few months. And she ran for president based on what? That she'd spent a ton of money, her own money, in a disastrous Senate campaign against Barbara Boxer in 2010, or that she had ran HP into the ground. Hewlett-Packard was a company that was associated with quality, and she decided, let's shift, let's pivot here. Let's be all about cheap, low-margin personal computers. Of course, she got a big golden parachute. I forget how much it was. What was her total compensation? $92 million or whatever. I did some research into her for my old podcast back in 2016, and I can't confirm this, but as far as I can tell, her Christian name is actually Carlton. Okay, not Kara, or not Carly. Okay, Carlton is it's a family name, and I believe it's one of those situations where they wanted a boy and they got a girl and they picked out a name, and so we have Carly Fiorina. And she's in The Atlantic, which is your one-stop shop for all Never Trump news. Republicans who say Donald Trump should lose in November but insist they won't vote for Joe Biden aren't being honest, Carly Fiorina argues. She was a Republican candidate for president just 4 years ago and was briefly Ted Cruz's prospective running mate. Trump needs to go, she says, and that means she's voting for Biden. Fiorina is not going to keep quiet, write in another candidate or vote third party. I've been very clear that I can't support Donald Trump, and elections are binary choices. She struggled with the decision on whether to go public, but she said that this struggle is one Republicans need to have, including those who have rationalized supporting Trump, despite their disagreements because of some of his policies or judicial appointments. I'm encouraged that Joe Biden is a person of humility and empathy and character. I think he's demonstrated that through his life. And I think we need humility and empathy everywhere in public life right now. And I think character counts. Well, she's a liar. Joe Biden is clearly not a person of humility. A person of humility does not get angry with people that they meet at campaign rallies and start ranting about how my IQ is higher than yours, and talking about his academic achievements, which are nugatory, lying about getting scholarships or finishing near the top of his class in law school, when I believe he finished 76th out of 85. Again, empathy, hey, fat, dog-faced, lying dog-faced pony soldier, that sort of thing. And his character, well, I don't know. Let's see. Making up stories about corn pop and the hairs on his leg, and children and the hairs on his leg, and sniffing every woman, including children, groping them, strong-arming the Ukraine for American aid money so that his son can become wealthy thereby. No. Let's see. There's, Tom Nichols, the professor and writer who's a Republican who's turned on Trump, tweeted a few weeks ago, "I'm not sure who my people are." Oh dear, Major Tom. He's a neocon, and he is just outraged that Trump has decided that he's just not going to bomb Middle Easterns to death for the hell of it. Tom Nichols has made it very clear, crystal clear, in recent months that he regards the majority of Americans with absolute loathing. And yeah, they never trump rump is a group of people who just regard flyover people, especially, as despicable, worthless. Because why are you living in flyover country? If you weren't a worthless person, you'd be living in a bugman hive, as I do. Oh, yes. Another one of my predictions has come true. That the media, they want the spike. They want that spike. Give us the spike. Come on, spike. You can do it. And of course, I'm referring to COVID-19. This is from Axios. The coronavirus surge is real and it's everywhere. And there's a map with various colors on it. The coronavirus pandemic is getting dramatically worse in almost every corner of the US. We're all going to die. Remember when they started saying that in February and it didn't happen? The big picture, the U.S. today is getting closer to the worst case scenario envisioned in the spring, a nationwide crisis. What do you mean? They've been saying it was a crisis ever since they decided to blame Trump for it. Made worse by a vacuum of political leadership threatening to overwhelm hospitals. Where have we heard that before? And spread out of control. Nationwide cases are up 30% compared to the beginning of this month, and dramatically worsening outbreaks in several states are beginning to strain hospital capacity. The same concern that prompted nationwide lockdown in the first place. This is the grimmest map in the 8 weeks since Axios began tracking the change in new cases in every state. This publication of the week, which used to, I don't know, it seemed to be not entirely a shitlib organ. Now it's just a shitlib organ. Someone named Ryan Cooper has written, "The world is putting America into quarantine." America is nowhere near the worst in terms of COVID-19, even considering the juiced numbers, the massively faked data, but never mind the death. The United States is in the midst of a full-blown second wave. Yay, we got that second wave of coronavirus. According to Worldometers, Tuesday had 36,050 new cases, the highest number since May 1st and the third highest ever. Arizona, Florida, South Carolina, California, and Texas are headed for a dire emergency fast. So far, deaths have thankfully not returned to their previous highs. Probably in part because the new surge appears to be hitting younger patients. But deaths are also a lagging indicator, and they're highly likely to start increasing soon. If you wish for it, then maybe it will happen. Who is being tested for COVID-19? People who showed serious symptoms. Apparently, you can't make that connection. We know a fair amount about COVID-19, that it is relatively harmless to the overwhelming majority of people, but the media is hoping otherwise. Europe, where they do everything better than the United States, just absolutely everything better than the United States, where most countries have largely contained the virus after initial screw-ups, is looking at America with slack-jawed horror. No, we can't have that. No, not Europe. The European Union is likely to close its borders to American travelers when it restores some international travel on July the 1st. Canada will most likely keep its U.S. border mostly closed when the current agreement expires on July 21st. Around the world, it's beginning to sink in how profoundly rotten the United States is. Unless America manages to turn things around, it will slide from the center of the international order to a peripheral, mistrusted basket case, and will deserve it. Is this guy mental? The United States remains the richest and most powerful nation on earth. But apparently, this is how it works. It's like the high school cafeteria. I'm finished with America. America's over. You're right. Nobody wants to hang with America anymore. Yeah, America's gross. Is that how international relations works, Ryan Cooper? Now, I several years ago, before I got tired of it, I used to go on about the COVID-19 conditions on Vancouver Island, where I live, making sure to point out that Vancouver Island, well, it's an island. Victoria is on an island, and that's important in terms of disease and its progression. And I was mocking the numbers from Vancouver Island because there was a lockdown here, not nearly as crazy as in, say, Alberta or Ontario, or in, say, New York, New Jersey, etc. But no, this 2-meter nonsense and dozens of people lining up outside of stores, and these stupid arrows put on the aisles of stores. We had all that. Let's see. This is a good news story, but the media is disappointed. Vancouver Islanders can no longer brag about the fact that there are no confirmed cases of COVID-19 on the island. On Monday, the island's first new case of COVID-19 in 6 consecutive weeks was confirmed by health officials, and the case is on southern Vancouver Island. Oh dear. Oh dear. Dr. Richard Stanwyck, Chief Medical Health Officer for Island Health, said the case is acquired in the community, which is basically code for saying somewhere in this person's travels they encountered somebody who had the virus and passed it on to them. We don't know who it is at this point. Oh dear. They're not even mentioning the numbers now, because there's something like about, 170 cases on the whole of the island, which has 750,000 people, and I believe there have been 3 deaths. This is not even close to a crisis, but no, we have to smash the economy, smash society, and eliminate civil rights, because the experts tell us to. Oh, yeah. So how do the libertarians, or the fusionist conservatives, the true conservatives, the classical liberal conservatives, how do they deal with COVID-19? Basically, you don't have any, civil rights anymore. You can't even leave your apartment. Can't even leave your home. How do they deal with it? Well, someone called Tiana Lowe, who has renamed herself Tiana, and she's, of course, wearing a face diaper. She writes, I agree. The left has not been better during this, but the left is not in charge right now. The buck is supposed to stop with Trump, so he'll get the blame. I'm not saying how it should be, but how it is. If you want Trump to win, wear a mask and continue to spend money if you can. She uses $. And I commented, wear a mask and continue to spend money if you can. This is conservatism in one sentence. Grovel to the experts, cower in fear, but above all, keep on consuming. Let's see. Yes, Eric Topol had tweeted, and it's increasingly looking like we will go to new pandemic heights of cases spread. And Alex Berenson tweeted, now do deaths or even hospitalizations, ICUs. See, if the people who are getting COVID-19 are asymptomatic, why is this a big problem or any kind of a problem? In fact, this suggests that the United States is heading towards herd immunity. We've had people carrying on about this virus for decades, and apparently they know nothing about the progress of disease and building up resistance to disease. Again, I suspect that, I suspected that I could seriously terrify people by talking about the fact that, 90% of Americans have Epstein-Barr virus? Oh, but do we know everything? What do we know about Epstein-Barr virus? Yes, it causes mononucleosis, but what else is it capable of? These people are idiots, absolute idiots. They are determined to literally scare us to death. In addition to crashing the economy, crashing society, and suspending our civil rights. And part of it is a determination to get rid of Donald Trump, to have him defeated in the election or have him removed by a coup or something. But this is just how grossly irresponsible these people are. And they are loving it. They are absolutely loving it. Their power to terrorize people. David A. French. He was one of the heroes of the Iraq War. He has a Bronze Star. And he's a true conservative, of course, although he started calling himself a classical liberal, which is at the antipodes to conservatism, but never mind that. They're just words. So here we are in the grips of an incredibly self-interested effort to pull more and more of the government into social media regulation, even to the point of potentially overriding long-cherished First Amendment freedoms. It's important to understand one reason why. So that he has this thread, which is absolutely worthless. People have pointed out that Twitter advertised itself. He was associated with the Arab Spring. You can speak freely on Twitter, and you don't even have to identify yourself. And then it was the bait and switch, the continual bait and switch. And, oh, yeah, these people made a gamble. People like me made a gamble investing all this time in Twitter. Well, I was providing, and I continue to provide content to Twitter, which draws people to their advertisers. But I responded to him, what do you think is the purpose of the First Amendment? Hint, it is not giving plausible deniability to monstrous corporations that act as publishers while they pretend to be platforms. Read Marsh versus Alabama. This is settled law, stare decisis, 1946. Supreme Court ruled that a state trespassing statute could not be used to prevent the distribution of religious materials on a town's sidewalk, even though the sidewalk was part of a privately owned company town. The court initially noted that it would be an easy case if the town were a more traditional publicly administered municipality. Then there would be a clear violation of the right to free speech for the government to bar the sidewalk distribution of such material. The question became, therefore, I'm reading from Wikipedia, whether or not constitutional freedom of speech protections could be denied simply because a single company held title to the town. The court, in its conclusion, stated that it was essentially weighing the rights of property owners against the rights of citizens to enjoy freedom of press and religion. The court noted that the rights of citizens under the Bill of Rights occupied a preferred position. Accordingly, the court held that the property rights of a private entity are not sufficient to justify the restriction of a community of citizens' fundamental rights and liberties. Oh, yeah, before we talk about the French Revolution, let's go back to the chat. Let's see. Super Predator, Biden will probably refuse to debate Trump on the grounds that he doesn't want to legitimize him or other such BS. No, it would be unsafe. They're not going to have a Democratic convention, okay? It's going to be distributed across the internet. Biden is going to be appearing in Milwaukee. Why? The delegates are been told to stay home. And no, I don't think he's going to debate Trump. No, he's not on the same stage. Not on the same stage. And you really can't have a proper debate unless the people are in the same room. Alex DeLarge, people genuinely need to relax about COVID at this stage. We know far more about it than we did in March, and treatment protocols have evolved, as has Alex DeLarge's position on this. Biden's poll numbers might be strong enough to simply ignore Trump. That would be a gamble, serious gamble. I see Danny Rose agrees with me on canceling debates. If it happens at all, it will be conducted virtually, says Super Predator, and Biden will be hopped up on Adderall. That's also, it seems that they came up with a pretty good cocktail for Hillary in 2016, but Hillary is nowhere near as gone, physically or mentally, as Joe Biden did. Brandon Smith says if Dems get in, they'll overturn the Electoral College and never lose another election. Yes. We hear every 4 years that this is the most momentous election since. Well, no, it's generally two. What was so momentous about 2012, 2008, 2004, 2000? You go back. You keep going back, right? We know what's going to happen. If Biden wins, the United States is going to become an autocracy. It's that simple. Freedom of speech will disappear. People will be put in prison for their political views. They're already being put in prison virtually. They may be put in prison actually. Good thing we got Gorsuch, says Danny Rose. I assume that's ironic. The Comte de Brea says 30% of Democrats are voting Trump. To the extent that this unrest continues, and of course it's all in areas that are controlled by the Democrats, and to the extent that the Democrats continue to justify it, for instance, calling it a great awakening, as Obama did yesterday, it's going to be harder for them to deny that they have become the Revolutionary Party. The Revolutionary Party. William Hicks says Dr. Ioannidis looked at 23 recent studies. Under infection fatality rate is 0.04%. Yes, indeed. Yo Mama says the Democrats don't have 38 states for that to happen. That is to change the rules regarding the Electoral College. Super Predator, DC and Puerto Rican statehood. Oh, yeah, Puerto Rican statehood. I look back at the time of, Harry Truman, when there was, assassination plots against him, one of which came very close to killing him. Why wasn't Puerto Rico given its independence then? Metal Mike says John Tory has announced that the Toronto police will be defunded. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to follow up on this. What are we going to have? Mental health drag queens intervene? Colby Kosh made this point that we're going to send mental health professionals into situations where it's some sort of mental health problem or some sort of disturbance, which often means a naked man holding a knife and screaming. Yeah, let's send the social workers. Let's send the social workers in to deal with that. Oh, this will involve cutting the budget by $100 million and giving that money to Black communities. I've been making various predictions for decades, and I guess I'm like Tom Wolfe said, the man who was right too soon. It never works out. I've been saying that Toronto is going to become Detroit, within a number of years, and they seem to be accelerating. They got the pedal to the metal. Danny Rose, social workers are some of the most incompetent people I've ever met. I've had some run-ins with social workers. When I was a teenager, I had a social worker myself. I've run into them through reporting and otherwise. They're overwhelmingly women, and they're overwhelmingly women who have had serious problems with growing up, with their childhood, claiming terrible parentage and they've often had bad boyfriends and husbands, even criminal boyfriends and husbands. Yeah, I wouldn't trust them with anything, but they have great powers. The French Revolution has been trending on Twitter. And let's see, someone called Caitlin Burns, and of course she's wearing a face diaper. Lindsey Graham had tweeted, it appears the French Revolution has now come to the Democratic Party based on initial primary results from New York and Kentucky. Caitlin Burns responded, oh yes, the infamous French Revolution. Yes, it was infamous, Caitlin, which overthrew an out-of-touch royalty and aristocracy out of power to install an American-style democracy. Is that what happened? Truly an evil forebear for Czech's notes, American democracy. Someone called Mythic Ethos responded, when your historical literacy is nothing more than a 7th grade public education. Okay. So, French Revolution in 1789. Then we have the execution of the king and the queen, I believe, in 1790. And then you have the Girondins, and then you have the Committee of Public Safety. Wow, that was really infamous. You have absolute madness. You have the massacres in the Vendée. You have, societal collapse. And when did all this end? When was this all worked out eventually? Well, in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna, after the final defeat of Napoleon. That is to say that the French Revolution ushered in calamity, whereby Europe was at war for 26 years. Yeah, how about that? How about that? And also widespread massacres. Well, particularly in a place like Spain, you could look up Goya, look at his paintings, the disasters of war, or his series, The Disasters of War, or his famous paintings about, public execution. Yeah, some people who worship Napoleon, I never trust anyone who worships Napoleon because he was a wrecker. Oh, he had big ideas about administration and law, but he was a wrecker. So apparently a lot of people have got into their heads, including one idiot from the New York Times. Are they all idiots now? That he was called out for basically, claiming the French Revolution or mocking these people who were talking about, the disaster of the French Revolution coming to America. And he said, oh, well, yeah, I know it was clusterfuck, but, I'm just trying to point out. This idiot obviously knows nothing about the French Revolution. What a disaster it was. Joseph de Maistre, who was a real conservative. This is quoted by Sohrab Armani. There is a satanic element in the French Revolution which distinguishes it from any other revolution known, or perhaps that will be known. My favorite opera, A Dialogue of the Carmelites, the music by Francis Poulenc, and the libretto by Georges Bernanos, is about a true story about a group community of nuns who were stripped of their habit. They were stripped of their positions of their churches and the like, and they were condemned to death and guillotined one after the other for the crime of being nuns, because the French Revolution declared war on religion and established a new religion, a cult of reason. And it was Goya who said, the dream of reason ends in nightmare. It always does. I want to speak briefly about Peter Turchin, who I'm going to commend to you. He is described in Wikipedia as a Russian-American scientist specializing in cultural evolution and cliodynamics. Clio being the muse of history, a mathematical modeling and statistical analysis of the dynamics of historical societies. And of special importance is his study of the hypothesis that population pressure causes increased warfare. He has written about cycles of societal turmoil and collapse. And he made a prediction, in 2010, that the United States was heading for big trouble in the 2020s. He wrote on June 1st, America is burning. Dozens of cities across the United States remain under curfews at a level not seen since riots following the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. You can find this at peterturchin.com. Most commentary is focused on the immediate causes of this wave of violence that has already continued for 6 days. And indeed, it's difficult to watch the video of George Floyd being slowly strangled to death without feeling rage and sorrow. But my job, as it were, is to look beyond the surface of the events to the deep structural causes. I've written elsewhere that the causes of rebellions and revolutions are in many ways similar to processes that cause earthquakes or forest fires. In both revolutions and earthquakes, it is useful to distinguish pressures, structural conditions, which build up slowly, from triggers, sudden releasing events which immediately precede a social or geological eruption. Specific triggers of political upheavals are difficult, perhaps even impossible to predict with any precision. And let's see. Readers of this blog are familiar with the chief structural pressures undermining social resilience: popular immiseration, intra-elite conflict, and the loss of confidence in state institutions. Turchin has written of the overproduction of elites. And when you look at these Antifa or Antifa-adjacent idiots on the streets of America destroying things, or hectoring police officers that they don't understand structural racism, including black police officers, you can see this overproduction of elites, because America generates millions of college graduates every year. And where are the jobs for them? The top jobs in America, the elite jobs, have become largely hereditary. America is turning into an oligarchy very quickly. These people have been educated to believe that they will be part of the elite running America, and then they learn quite cruelly that that is not going to be the case, and that they would be lucky getting jobs as baristas at Starbucks. Oh, yeah, I want one of those sweet NGO jobs. A lot of competition for those jobs, and it really helps, if you have the right parents for these jobs. His forecast, 2010, was not simply a projection of the contemporary trend in social instability into the future. Social instability in major Western countries had been, in fact, declining prior to 2010. Rather, the basis for this forecast was a quantitative model that took as inputs the major structural drivers for instability, as mentioned earlier, and translated them into a political stress index. And he talks about this immiseration. And last year I had an interesting conversation with someone I'll call the Washington Insider. She asked me why my structural demographic model predicted rising instability in the USA, probably peaking with a major outbreak of political violence in the 2020s. I started giving the explanation based on the three main forces: popular immiseration, intra-elite competition, and state fragility. But I didn't get very far because she asked me, what immiseration? What are you talking about? We've never lived better than today. Global poverty is declining, child mortality is declining, violence is declining. We have access to the level of technology that is miraculous compared to what previous generations had. Just look at the massive data gathered together by Max Rosen, or read, wait for it, Steven Pinker's books to be impressed with how good things are. There are three biases that sustain this rosy view. The first to focus on global issues, but the decrease of poverty in China, which is what drives declining global poverty because Chinese population is so huge, or the drop in child mortality in Africa, is irrelevant to working America. People everywhere compare themselves not to some distant places, but to the standard of living they experienced in their parents' home. And the majority of American population sees that in many important ways they are worse off than their parents. Now, I just feel sometimes that, the elite, not that I, care for their survival, they should be, shaken by the shoulders and say, nobody gives a toss about amelioration of conditions in Africa or China. What they want to know is, what is my standard of life going to be? And when they discover that it's going to be worse than their parents and much worse than their grandparents, this causes grave societal difficulties. But our elite is too stupid to understand this, which is a white pill for me, because such an elite as stupid as this is unsustainable. One last thing about off topic, that is to say the topic of Kieslowski's film, The Decalogue. This is for Breitbart. New York Governor Cuomo to Florida Governor DeSantis: you played politics with this virus and you lost. For Andrew Cuomo, Governor Death, to point the finger at anyone is absolutely remarkable. Just remind you all that Cuomo forced infected people into nursing homes, long-term care facilities that were not equipped to isolate them from the elderly in these institutions, which resulted in a massive die-off. The same thing happened in Ontario, and especially Quebec, and to a lesser extent in my own province of British Columbia. But the hubris demonstrated by Andrew Cuomo, Governor Death, is astonishing. And I pray that we are following the classical rule here, that his hubris in particular, will be followed with nemesis. So we're on to Theater Thursday. And what I'm going to talk about is the first half, 5 episodes of a television series, a series for Polish television that Krzysztof Kieslowski made in 1988. Kieslowski lived from 1941 to 1996. And actually, in the old Theater Thursday on Luke Ford's show, I talked about Three Colors Red, and Luke Ford did not like that film at all. He really did not like it, because there's a very strong element of the fantastic in that film. There is not much of the fantastic in Decalogue. It's kind of a gritty, if you will, a chamber drama. Kieslowski became successful, well, in the West at any rate, only in the last decade of his life, with Decalogue, The Double Life of Veronique, and his Three Colors trilogy. Kieslowski, he was a Pole. I suppose he was a Catholic of sorts, not Orthodox in observance or belief. But of course, it deeply informed his philosophy. Yes, he had a personal and private relationship with God. He was first known for his political films, but we see with Decalogue that he has moved away from politics. There's some politics in Three Colors trilogy, but it is not what you would call partisan politics. It is not. These aren't anti-communist films. Stanley Kubrick wrote the foreword to the print edition of the scripts of Decalogue, or Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, which was published by Faber and Faber in 1991. The idea for this series came from the co-writer, Krzysztof Pisiewicz. And this is what Kubrick had to write. I'm always reluctant to single out some particular feature of the work of a major filmmaker because it tends inevitably to simplify and reduce the work. But in this book of screenplays by Krzysztof Kieslowski and his co-author Krzysztof Pisiewicz, it should not be out of place to observe that they have the very rare ability to dramatize their ideas rather than just talking about them. By making their points through the dramatic action of the story, they gain the added power of allowing the audience to discover what's really going on rather than being told. They do this with such dazzling skill, you never see the ideas coming and don't realize until much later how profoundly they have reached your heart. Now, if you've heard me talk about films in the past, you know that one of the things that I hate is excess narrative, explanation. You're not getting very much in the Decalogue. Not at all, because it's not necessary. Kieslowski didn't think so, and Kubrick didn't think so, and Bob Fosse didn't think so, and I don't know, I don't think so. That's pretty good. That is pretty good, company. There are two versions of the Decalogue available in English, in Blu-ray, that is. Criterion has a box set, and Masters of Cinema has a box set. And the authoritative DVD Beaver has this to say that it is rare for me to say that a competitor to Criterion has done a better job of it. There's more discs in the Masters of Cinema set, and there are more extras as well. And there's also technical stuff about converting from European TV frames per second, which I won't get into, but the Arrow, no, sorry, not Masters of Cinema, Arrow films. Sorry for the confusion. The British version is better. Now, you will need an all regions player. It's region B. The Arrow box set is region B, but I have it, and it's truly outstanding. It's truly one of the great Blu-ray productions. Now, I thought that obviously it's called the Decalogue. It has to do with the Ten Commandments. It is not really a didactic film or series of film. It's philosophical speculations that are spun off from the Ten Commandments in the lives of people who live in Warsaw, in monstrous apartment blocks. Warsaw was one of those beautiful cities in Europe, but it was largely destroyed during World War II, especially when the Soviets decided to bide their time on the east side of the Vistula River while the Germans destroyed Warsaw. They did this because they wanted the true Polish resistance to be wiped out by the Germans, and that which survived was, in short order, wiped out by the communists. Now, people may look at these tower blocks. It's sort of a tower block farm sort of thing you see in many communist countries. And you may look at the one in Decalogue and think this is terrible. Well, apparently this was one of the very best in Warsaw. One is impressed watching this film, just how shabby life was in communist countries. I thought that I would read from an interview, some interviews that Kieślowski gave that explains his purpose. I should mention that Kieslowski, he didn't like professional actors that much, especially stage actors. He mistrusted, or rather hated, what he considered to be their histrionics. He had a very sort of Bressonian view of this. I'm referring to the French director Robert Bresson, who referred to his actors as models. If you watch the Decalogue, if you're looking for big dramatic scenes, well, you're not going to get them from the actors. The actors are very subdued. Now, one could say that life in communist Poland was subdued, but Kieslowski thought that, as a general principle, that it shouldn't be the actors, being in the forefront as they are in so many other films, is the the cart dragging the horse. So he's asked the question, and this is by Bozina Janicka. This is from a 1988 interview from the magazine Film. That she says, it's difficult to consider the Decalogue as an idea like any other. It's too significant. Kieslowski replied, it seemed to us that it was a good, clear-cut topic for contemporary times. That's obvious. When everything around is falling apart, it is worthwhile to turn to fundamental questions. Besides, it is always a good time to remember the Decalogue. Those commandments have existed for 6,000 years, more or less. No one has ever objected to them. And at the same time, every day for thousands of years, we have all been breaking those commandments. He's asked, you saw in the Decalogue only generally accepted ethical norms. Have you taken into account also the religious dimension? He responded, no, the religious aspects we left aside. But I do hope that in the films themselves, one will be able to find something of these values, certainly metaphysics. He's asked about two particular episodes, both of which became feature films, a short film about killing and a short film about love. Those are episodes 5 and 6. In a few weeks, I'll talk about the last 5 episodes and a short film about love, which is perhaps the most moving episode to me, although episode 1 is certainly a close rival. And he's asked, the theme of both films is close to the idea that if you don't practice good, you stand on the side of evil. This was St. Augustine's view, by the way. Do you accept this extreme moral stand? Kieslowski said, I could be an extremist, but I just don't want to be a pedagogue. I don't intend to teach. However, I want to warn myself and others, not because I know better. It's simply that I can be heard better because I have the appropriate tools, a camera, film, actors, and so on. I think we all should look around and inform one another what we are thinking about, what we are doing, what we are feeling, hence my right to inform others. He's asked, it seems to me it is essentially a religious thought. It reminds me of a beautiful sentence from the letter to the Hebrews, stir up one another to love and good works. Kieslowski responds, if I really had to define the Decalogue's message, it would sound more like this. Live attentively, look around you, look to see if you are not troubling others with your actions, not doing harm, not causing pain. This thought, I know well it is neither mine nor new, will be appearing and reappearing through all of the films. Kieslowski originally was looking at getting 10 different directors. He decided to direct them all himself, with a couple of exceptions. There are different cinematographers used, and we see varying results, particularly in episode 5, which is shot in a very stylized way. Kieslowski said that it seemed to me to be hearkening back to kind of painterly style that one sees in, say, Dutch masters such as Rembrandt. But Kieslowski said that it was kind of a deliberate uglification because episode 5, which became a short film about killing, it is a very ugly story indeed. And if you just hold with me here, I wanted to go. This is from a book called Christoph Kieslowski Interviews, edited by Renata Bernard and Stephen Woodward, from the Conversations with Filmmakers series. And he gave a particular interview about episode 5, which became a short film about killing. And he's asked why there is nothing about the trial in this episode. And he said, I was not interested in the trial in itself. The outcome is obvious since we all know what the lawyer and prosecutor will say and what the sentence will be. And again, staying away from this mindless, narrative impulse, staying away from useless histrionics. Your Honor, I beg you, gentlemen and women of the jury, this sort of stuff. He's not interested in that. What interested me most is everything that exists in the unseen recesses of the human soul behind the scenes of murder. And then he explains, you remember a scene in Citizen Kane in which a character speaks of 2 boats that pass each other, with one character on one boat and another on the second. The man and the woman cross paths never to see each other again. Had they met again, the life of Citizen Kane might have been different. What interested me the most is how the life of a human being is affected by one event, and how, if something else happens, his life takes a different turn. People are linked to each other. There are invisible threads. Now, while we were talking together, there is a worker from an aircraft factory who is fighting with his wife. Neither I nor you know him, and we will never meet him. But because he is furious after fighting with his wife, he will not tighten a screw correctly, even though he does it every day. It may be you, me, or our wives in 5 years who will take the plane and it will explode. We are tied to this man, but we do not know it now. There is in the depths the idea that the seeds of a future event are being sown. The only problem is finding this thread. He's asked by Hubert Nielgre, a short film about killing as a form of very dark humor. The taxi driver who refuses drunks but agrees to take this young man who seems nice, or the condemned man who is offered a cigarette but who prefers a cigarette without filter. The black humor is an integral part of the moral. Yes, this is a great series of film about smoking, and Kieslowski was a champion smoker himself. Now, as I mentioned before, poor people love cigarettes. It is a cheap way for government to pacify people. People feel better with cigarettes, and cigarettes were plentiful in the communist countries, although amusingly, one of the themes is its Americanization of Poland, particularly, American logos, Coca-Cola, but Marlboro in particular. In episode 4, the daughter has this enormous blow-up of a rather grotesque Marlboro poster from Germany with Rocky Mountains and rugged mountain folk and the like. We see this again and again. Kieslowski says the black humor is there because the absurd is a part of our lives. It affects us. It does not make us laugh. That's what comedy is, good comedy. Very funny things happen to the characters, but that are tragic to them. And the interviewer asks, what are also interesting are the false leads. The young man is in the cafe. It's the policeman that he wants to kill. If he was not relieved by the change of shift, he would have been the victim. And Kieslowski says, I play a sort of game with the viewer, since indeed there was not enough action to fill out this story. There was a need for little events, false leads. I guess I'll start talking about episode 5, Thou Shalt Not Kill, because to lead on from this interview, Kieslowski was clearly a liberal, small L liberal. He felt very strongly about the death penalty. And this episode, I suppose, could be seen as a moving plea against the death penalty. I'll get to my feelings about the death penalty in a moment, but I really have to commend Kieslowski, because anti-death penalty artistic efforts tend to be about wrongful verdicts, or people, women who were so mistreated by their husbands that they feel they have no choice but to kill them. No. Jacek, the killer in episode 5, he's a terrible, terrible person. We see him, he comes from the countryside near Krakow to Warsaw. God knows what he's doing there. He doesn't have a job. We don't even know whether he has a place to stay. He has little money. But he wants to hurt people. He wants to cause mayhem. We see him on a bridge, and he drops a rather large stone from the bridge, which smashes the windshield of a car, and we hear a screech. We don't know what happens after that. We see him getting into it with an old babushka near a statue and scaring off the pigeons. We see him throw a man into a pissoir. I suppose it could be, the man looks at him and smiles, and perhaps our anti-hero thought this was some sort of homosexual come-on, but in any event, he throws him into the pissoir, and he commits a murder. Well, why? Is it furtherance of theft, of robbery? Well, we don't know, because it would seem that he wanted to kill a member of the militia simply because he wanted to kill somebody. And there is no sparing the pointlessness and the brutality of the killing of the taxi driver. And Kieslowski really must be commended for this. He is taking the worst case scenario and arguing that even a man such as Jacek should be spared the death penalty. Now, at the other end of the film, we see the last, 15 minutes of his life. The young liberal advocate who defended him unsuccessfully in court because, the facts are completely against him. I mean, there's no disputing the facts. He's emotionally invested in this. He is told by one of his superiors that he is too sensitive to practice law, and he probably is, because it is a machine, as he says. And we see the final cigarette given to Jacek, and it has to be filterless. Even at the moment of death, he's not going to accept a cigarette with a filter. And you see his hands shaking so violently. And you see all of these militia members surrounding him. And you think, it seems excessive. But then he seems to be ready to die, and it turns out that he's not ready to die, and he attempts to escape, and it takes about half a dozen men to restrain him. And we had been shown earlier, very matter-of-factly, how a hanging is set up. There's the death rope, and there's the noose, and that's a real noose in the film, not a phony noose, not a Bubba noose. It's a real noose. And we see how it is raised, the gear system that raises it. And we see the little pan that's put in the death trap in order to catch the urine and feces, which typically emanate from men who have been hanged. And we see the hanging itself. None of this is sugar-coated at all. It's as Kieslowski sees it, it is brutality being met with brutality, murder being met with murder. I don't see it that way at all. I'll just say that, on the contrary, execution gives a man a chance to attempt to make amends for what he has done, to confess his guilt, to save his soul. I think the real cruel and unusual punishment, the monstrous punishment, is life imprisonment. Now, for the most part, it never ends up that way. These people get out after 15 or 20 years, but there's certain people. Sirhan Sirhan is still in prison since 1968, and there are many such examples. Albert Speer wrote in his Spandau Diaries that he spent 20 years in Spandau, as did Rudolf Hess and others. He'd come to the conclusion that no man could spend more than 5 years in prison without being broken, without becoming less than a man. And that seems reasonable enough to me. I'll just point out that imprisonment, as we know it now, was a supposedly liberal reform of the late 19th century. Before that, throughout history, there were no prisons as we know them. There were debtors' prisons. If you paid what you owed or got someone to pay it, then you were out. In the past, a serious crime was dealt with by execution, banishment, or some sort of physical mutilation. Because I don't think it really occurred to our ancestors to keep people in prison for years or decades, let alone the tremendous cost of this, and the fact that these prisoners are not going to be well suited to integration in society when they come out. There is also the issue of cruelty. So let's get to the other episodes of the Decalogue. Now, I should mention before I do that there are quite a few unifying devices in the Decalogue. The stories are all set in, or in some way connected to what are now known as the Decalogue apartments. We have characters from one episode appearing in other episodes, typically in bit parts. We have an actor, Artu Barsis, who appears in 8 of the episodes. He is a young, pale, blonde man who never speaks and is watching. It's much debated about the purpose of him appearing. Well, he is some sort of watcher. Perhaps he is a representative of God. Perhaps he is God's watcher on earth. And that's all I can say about that. But it is a very powerful, unifying device. The first episode, the first commandment, I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not have any other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. And the first episode is perhaps, I don't know, it's shamelessly manipulative, but I say this as someone who's as you know, a great admirer of Stanley Kubrick, and Kubrick was not afraid in Barry Lyndon or in Clockwork Orange and other films to be shamelessly manipulative. And the story of the boy and his father in Decalogue episode 1 is, you can see it. Yes, I wrote some time ago, I like to talk about manipulation in film. Has there ever been a more powerful manipulation than Krzysztof Kieslowski finding the most beautiful boy as his sacrificial victim in Decalogue? And there is also an allusion to Barry Lyndon with, yes, perhaps one reason Kubrick liked Kieslowski's Decalogue so much was the homage to Barry Lyndon in The Fatal Gift to the dearly loved son. In this case, it is a pair of ice skates. The characters in Decalogue. There is actually, you're thinking this is all pretty grim. Episode 10 is a kind of slapstick comedy. It's really a palate cleanser. There is a lot of dark humor, as noted, but these are serious stories about serious questions. It is, we see the upper strata of Polish society, doctors or, head doctors, heads of wards, violinist in the Warsaw Philharmonic, the professor in episode 1. I don't know what he was a professor was. I'm going to guess linguistics, okay? And I think there's a kind of meta joke in there. In one scene, he is explaining the difficulty of translation, quoting T.S. Eliot, to the point that poetry is that which cannot be translated. But of course, with foreign films, there's two difficulties. One, that you're dealing with people that you don't know these people and you don't know their culture very well, in most cases. And secondly, they're not speaking your language. So, of course, any language can be translated, but there are so many nuances. There are so many things which are bound up with the culture and the thinking of a certain people that it's always approximate. And the professor in episode 1 talks about this while his delightful boy is looking at him from various angles and through various obstacles. The professor he's a highly intelligent fellow. He is separated from his wife, who is at some distance away, some great distance away. We don't know why. Is it important? He is the feminine presence in his life, the young boy Pavel. It comes from his father's sister. She is a believer, a Catholic believer, and the father is not. Pavel is, besides being a beautiful boy, he is highly intelligent and industrious. He's learning English. He can program on the computer. And I don't know well, I can't really speak to the state of personal computers in Poland in 1988, but this professor has 2 of them. And his programming is quite well advanced. He has written programs using devices such that he can lock and unlock doors and turn on and off lights and turn faucets on and off. And Pavel is always looking to solve problems using mathematics or physics. Pavel is he's a very happy young boy, but he's beginning to be troubled by aspects of the universe. He sees a dead dog. There's a lot of stray dogs in Decalogue as well. And he's quite put out about this, and he asks his father what death means. And his father gives him a very, a scientific and dry explanation of the cessation of life. The heart stops pumping blood to the brain and everything quits. What's left? The boy asks. And the father gives a very unconvincing answer about, memories, quirks. But then he says, reasonably enough, it's too early in the day for this sort of thing. He has a conversation with his aunt, and his aunt explains that from a very early age, even earlier than you, your father realized that things could be counted and measured, and that's how he sees life. The father agrees for Pavel to take religious instruction. And it is winter, and there's a pond that is frozen, and the professor, being very responsible, he takes measurements. He gets meteorological observations, and he knows about how ice is formed, and he does the calculations, and he also makes a personal inspection. So it is safe for his boy to go skating. Well, there had been some troubling episodes, an eruption of the numinous into the professor's atheist world. it would seem that the computer had turned itself on of its own volition. And there was the blinking. We're back in the DOS days here. This is before GUIs. And there's a blinking, the cursor. I am ready. Ready for what? And Pavel asks, what is my mother dreaming of? The computer says, I do not know. And Pavel thinks, well, my father has a better computer. That computer would know. You see this science becoming a rival religion, and it comes to a terrible end. And we see the father, of course, is absolutely distraught, and he finds himself in a church which is being constructed. And the parishioners have already, they've already put up all these candles in the scaffolding, and there's quite an astonishing scene when the father decides to wreck the scaffolding. I mentioned earlier, I know that women have told me, women who have children have told me that they couldn't bear to watch this, or they felt cruelly abused after it was over. So, I'll warn you, this is quite harrowing. The second commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Now, again, when I talked about aspects, this relates to one scene in particular where a doctor is asked to swear something, swear a diagnosis of being true. Now, there's a great mystery here because we don't know. He does swear. He does take the name of the Lord in vain, but we don't know whether this is a false oath or not. Kieslowski is very good at making unsympathetic people sympathetic by immersing you into their world. The doctor, who is not named, there is a woman named Dorota Geller, and she plays the symphony, and she's a quite striking woman. There are a lot of beautiful Polish women, I must say that. And she is a really remarkable looking blonde. And she knows the doctor from the past because she ran over his dog, and he hasn't forgotten that. Her husband is in the hospital, and he is gravely ill. He is in a coma or close to it. He sort of comes in and out, but he's not really taking anything in. And Dorota has a very serious problem because she's been carrying on an affair with another man, a pianist, a soloist pianist. And she had thought that she was barren. I would guess her to be in her late 30s. But she becomes pregnant, clearly, by a man who is not her husband. And she realizes that if she has an abortion, there's a lot of abortion, or talk about abortion in Decalogue, because abortion was just, it was a reliable and routine form of birth control in communist countries. It was not unusual for women to have 4, 5, 6 or more abortions. So she's concluded that, there's kind of prisoner's dilemma here, that in a way she wants her husband to die so that she can keep the baby. But if her husband doesn't die, then she's going to kill the baby. And she starts showing up. She starts stalking the doctor, who, is wary of her because of her imperious nature and also because she ran over his dog. She asks for a favor from him, and he says, well, the families get consultations on certain days, and she says, I wish I'd run you over. Again, Kieslowski is not attempting to sugarcoat any of these people. Now, we learn in stages a secret about the doctor, that back in the wartime days, something terrible had happened to his family, as happened to so many Polish families in those terrible days. And I don't know, I suppose it's not really his business, but he tells her, don't kill the child. And there's some ambiguity as to the course of Dorota's husband's illness. This word progression is used. There's a suggestion that the disease is metastasizing and that he's a goner, and that is, in fact, what he tells Dorota. Then we see him. We've seen water leaking out of a wall, down a pipe, and into a bowl, which is stained with metal. And we had seen introduced a jar of strawberry preserves, which someone has been eating, and there's in a glass, and there's a truly remarkable scene where we see that a bee has been attracted to the sweetness, and it becomes trapped in the water. There's a spoon in the water and is attempting to climb up the spoon to get out of the glass. And of course, the metaphorical relation to the patient's own condition is obvious, but the scene is no less moving besides that. And there is a kind of a miracle, and the suggestion is that the miracle occurred because the doctor lied to Dorota. Episode 3, remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Now, it's Christmas Eve, so this is the stand-in for the Sabbath day. Of course, Christmas, once every 7 years, occurs on the Sabbath day. And it is about a nightmare Christmas. There is a lot of strong women in the Decalogue, well, a lot of strong women in Kieslowski's work generally. That doesn't mean that they are pleasant women. And the woman Eva, who is the star or the anti-hero of Decalogue 3, is an absolutely impossible woman. Oh, I learned something. I have some advice for you. A Polish woman called Eva, do never pronounce it in the German way, Eva. They become terribly offended, as I have learned to my cost. She is a remarkably striking woman. She's played by Maria Pekulnis. You see a lot of the actors who appear in the Decalogue, they don't have Wikipedia entries, which tells me that they were largely amateur actors selected by Kieslowski. She has this remarkable look, this remarkable searching look, and a pair of the most remarkably colored eyes, the palest blue imaginable. She has this exceedingly powerful sexual aura. And she had an affair with Janusz, who's a cab driver. There's a lot of cab drivers. Cabs play a big role in Decalogue. You see the many ways in which this is unified. And Eva's husband burst in to a hotel room where they were conducting their tryst. And Eva has blamed Janusz for this, saying that he wanted to end the relationship, and so he, in effect, engineered Eva's husband being revealed to be a cuckold. And so he goes back. Janusz goes back to his wife, and they have their children, this charming family. There's a lot of beautiful children in the Decalogue. Poles are very handsome people. And so Eva shows up on Christmas Eve, peering through the glass, and she is determined to wreck the Christmas of this family, and of Janusz in particular, from having abandoned her. And she shows up with this story, and of course, Janusz is thunderstruck by this and rather terrified. He has just gone to no small effort to play Santa Claus for his children. They had been at midnight mass, and he sees Eva there. It's a chance meeting, but Janusz knows that this is not going to be a pleasant evening. Eva has a story that her husband has disappeared. and that she fears that he is dead. And so he is blackmailed, as it were, into joining a search party for the missing man. And so we see a wild ride, little Dante-esque ride through Warsaw on a deserted Christmas Eve, including a visit to the morgue, a visit to the hospital, a visit to the drunk tank, which is particularly demonic. There is a sadistic keeper there with a shaven head who delights in hosing down with cold water, obviously deranged drunks who have been stripped naked. There's a surprise in this. There's a very big surprise in this, which I won't spoil for you. Eva is not exactly who she appears to be, and actually she is looking. She engineers a series of events in order to settle a bet that she has made with herself. Now, Janusz's wife, he leaves the house. Oh, my taxi has been stolen. And she says, is it really that important? And he says, well, it's how we make our livelihood. And when she says, is it really that important? She clearly suspects that Eva is involved again. She's no dummy. And she calls the police and she finds out what is happening. But this is a nightmarish episode, no question about it. Episode 4, Honor Thy Father and Thy Mother, it's an odd episode. We have a woman called Anna, or Anka, who is a gorgeous young woman. She's 20 years old in this. You see a lot. I get the impression that the new wave in dress and hairstyles came to Poland about 10 years later than it came to the West, because you see all these young women, the way they're dressed, and their asymmetrical, sort of choppy hair. It's clearly influenced by the Western New Wave. Anka is an acting student, very serious in Poland, getting into an acting school. You have to prove yourself in all these different disciplines. And we see that she has a very close relationship with her father, Mikhail. And we see this horseplay on Easter Monday, the splashing representing baptism. And we feel disconcerted because it seems that this relationship between father and daughter is closer than it should be. And there's a sexual connection there, clearly, or an incipient one. When her father is off on business, Anka, she finds a document, and it's for my daughter. After my death, her mother died 4 days after she was born, and wrote a testament of some sort to her daughter. We learn later that Anna had known about this for quite some time and wanted to know why her father hadn't given her the letter. He's told her that I wanted to give it to you when you were 10, and then I wanted to give it to you when you were 15. Then at 10, I thought you were too young, and at 15, I thought you were too old. We see that Anna has had a series of lovers since the time that, I don't know, maybe she was 15. She's already had an abortion, and she fears that she has been knocked up by her current boyfriend. But she tells him that I got the curse today, so it was a false alarm. And Anna has suspected for some time that Mikhail is not her father. And we're taken on a kind of a wild goose chase again in this episode as well, because we're introduced to something as the truth, which turns out that it is not, in fact, the truth. And it ends with a great ambiguity. I should mention that the music for all the episodes is by Zbigniew Preissner, and it is quite good. It is rather austere, making use of synthesizers. It is, splashes of color, tones, mostly no great themes, but very effective. I could talk about the Decalogue for I've been talking about 45 minutes. I could talk about it for hours, and I'm only talking about the first half. I'll just end up by saying that it is one of the most remarkable artistic creations of the 20th century, and I urge everyone to get a copy of it or to find some other way of watching it. So let's look at the look at the chat here. Half Galician says acting was serious in Eastern Europe because jobs were often with national theater companies. In Prague, 2000, I dated a woman doing Taming of the Shrew at a local public theater. Well, yeah, you see that the theater, the other arts, they've been taken over by the government, and they were, it was a means to advance communism. And so, yeah, it was taken very seriously, and there was tremendous resources put into it because, Polish actors, Polish musicians, et cetera, they were the representatives of Polish communism, not just in Poland, but throughout the world. Kieslowski, despite the years he spent in theater, seemed to have a rather dim opinion of this. He thought that the training in Poland led to a kind of deadly formalism. Okay, a lot of talk about secular coronism, in which I have no interest whatsoever. And so that's the show for this week. But let's talk about what's coming up on Theater Thursday and the book club. Just hang on, give me a second here. Let me scroll up to the top. Another foreign film with subtitles, The Lives of Others, which is about East Germany, another Warsaw Pact country. It's from 2006, and it is directed by Florian Donnersmarck. On July the 9th, we have a movie which is compared to Fellini's 8.5, but I much prefer. It is Bob Fosse's All That Jazz. It is simply absolutely extraordinary. One of the tests of a great film for me does it concern a genre in which I have no interest or even hate? I do not like musical theater, not one little bit. But All That Jazz is about musical theater, and I love it. In the same way that I do not like ballet, not one little bit. I consider it to be bogus art. I consider it to be an opera divertissement, which got too big for its capizios. But The Red Shoes is one of the most glorious films ever made. On July 16th, John Ford's Immortal: The Searchers. A few years ago, the true conservatives decided this was an ugly, nasty, racist film, proving once again that they're allergic to reality, particularly historical reality. And on July 23rd, a surrealist American masterpiece, I know that sounds strange, but it's true, from William Peter Blatty, 1980, The Ninth Configuration. On the book club tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about something new in history, new sources of knowledge, not merely interpretation. It's called The Fate of Rome by Kyle Harper on July the 3rd, After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre, a novel on June the 10th, The Assassination of Jesse James by Ron Hansen, a book about marijuana on July the 17th, Teach Your Children by Alex Berenson, and on July the 24th, I thought that this was apropos, given the autonomous zones springing up around America, G.K. Chesterton's The Napoleon of Notting Hill. I will be back on the air on Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for listening and or viewing. If you like the show, I greatly appreciate it if you would click on the like button and or subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to support this show, which would be greatly appreciated, particularly at this time, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And I leave you with this. In these times of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly hope that you, my dear listeners and viewers, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Thank you. Good night.